Hello and welcome to the third in our series of short webinars going through the units for the Vet Cert standard in veterinary management for consulting level. This session is Unit 3, Roots of Veteran Trees and the Soil Environment. So there are 4 subheadings in this particular unit. Describe the natural soil environment and how this affects tree health. Factors which can have a detrimental impact on the soil environment around veteran trees and recognise these on site, in situ. Be able to identify remediation options for degraded growing conditions around veteran trees. Identify where roots and mycorrhizal fungi grow. Now this is a very large topic, both in relation to veteran trees but also trees in general. Roots and the soil environment. There's a lot of material out there, and we hope that you will use some of that material that's available both in textbooks and videos and so on. And we have a number of fact sheets and films that were taken in relation to both the Vet Tree and the Vet Cert project, which can help you in some of these areas if you would like to freshen up and deepen your knowledge. So the first one, describe the natural soil environment and how this affects tree health. And also particularly why veteran trees are susceptible to changes in this environment. And this is again, the issue of soil and roots is important for all trees, but some of the more specific issues in relation to veteran trees are what we want to pick up within the standard. So natural cycles and nutrient movement, those are kind of the 2 elements. And just kind of identifying the process, the nitrogen fixing bacteria. This is all basic soil biology, and that changes in the soil environment affect natural cycles, which affect nutrient movement and the recycling processes. Soil is a living ecosystem with huge numbers of organisms, and recycling of nutrients and creating suitable conditions for tree growth is what we as tree managers need to ensure. And because veteran trees in particular, are so long-lived, they've often been present on a particular piece of soil or land for centuries, and they can't move easily into new areas, obviously. And rapid changes in that environment have happened in the last 150 years with changes in agriculture, with nitrogen deposition, local climate condition, and so on, all have an impact on the soil, which in turn have an impact on veteran trees, and that we have to ensure that any of those changes that take place, if it's down to us at least, happen slowly, and that we keep the balance, the natural balance, as far as possible. And as part of the standard, we would be expecting you to be able to identify the range of organisms present within the soil and what role they have in contributing to how well the soil functions. And this is a general issue that's not specific to veteran trees, but it's important for you to be able to prove that you have that knowledge in relation to the management of veteran trees. And we have these decomposers and detritivores, invertebrates, fungi and bacteria. And they input and recycle organic matter, and they have different functions in that process. So worms, for example, they recycle nutrients from the leaf litter and other organic matter. They release organic material and they help aerate the soil. So that's their function. Then fungi, in particular mycorrhizal fungi, which are in symbiosis with the tree roots, they can enable more efficient uptake of water and nutrients, but there are also other fungi involved in the breakdown of saprosylic material in the soil. And then we have bacteria, which fix nitrogen and make it accessible to the tree. But there's also interrelationships between these different groups. So we have invertebrates that browse on fungal hyphae, for example. So a healthy soil is full of life, and each of these elements have an important part to play. The earthworm being a very crucial one for trees in particular, because they aerate the soil and help decompact the soil as well. They're one of the best tools we have in our toolbox. And then, of course, different soil types have an impact on the rooting environment. And at least in the UK, there are these kind of sand, clay, loam are the three kind of points on the triangle, if you like. And the differences between those soil types are to do with particle size and the relationship with air and water. So, for example, sand, clay and loam soils, they all have different characteristics in terms of the availability of air and the minerals and nutrients and water. And that, of course, has an impact on tree roots and has a consequence for how trees grow. So an example here that we would expect you to be able to identify is that trees growing on well-drained soils, sandy soils, may suffer drought conditions more frequently than those on loamy soils, for example, and that clay soils have small particles in comparison to sand, which has large particles, and that clay holds more water and can be more easily compacted and is more susceptible to anaerobic conditions. Sand, on the other hand, holds much less water and can be less easily compacted, but more likely and susceptible to drought. And the fact that clay compacted soils and sand, which are less compacted, can actually have the same impact, that because of compaction or because of lack of water can also in effect be drought conditions, simulated drought conditions. So being able to distinguish between these different elements is important for a vet cert qualified person to understand and to be able to explain. So the second element of this unit is describing the factors which can have a detrimental impact on the soil environment around veteran trees and being able to recognise these. And the first one of those is identifying the effects of deficient or excessive nutrients, pollutants and contaminants on veteran trees. And the elements here we're looking at are the disruption of the natural processes, the impact that that has on nutrient and water uptake, and the impact on growth. So here, for example, nutrient deficiencies may result in a reduction in health and new growth. You can have discoloration. That nutrient excess, for example, if there's lots of fertilizers, it may be a loss of the symbiotic relationship, for example, between mycorrhizal fungi and the roots of the trees, which may also in turn reduce their ability to take up water and nutrients. It may also even reduce their resilience to stress. Pollutants and contaminants, of course, they have all sorts of impact. They may be toxic to roots and to mycorrhizae as well. So all of these will have an impact on growth. They'll have an impact on growth on all trees, but particularly veteran trees have less ability to cope and respond to these changes as quickly. And then the next part is kind of the different types of soil damage and thinking about options for avoiding or reducing the impact. So 2 and 3 in this level are related to one another. The first is kind of identifying the soil damage and the options for avoiding or reducing the impact, but then also how we remediate. So I guess compaction, erosion and changes in soil level are kind of the 3 key soil damage aspects that we often see in relation to veteran trees and trees more generally. So here, soil compaction, where mediation of that may be having a fence, but parking vehicles within the root protection area. Ploughing is, of course, a very common feature that we see in our old parklands, where often they're ploughed up close, and here you can even see that there's been some sort of spraying on the lower stems of the trees. And then fencing, which can be a positive thing to help the tree and keep the distance away from it. But fencing can also be a problem because it can change the environment in which the soil environment in which the tree is growing, if it's been grazed before or if it's fencing, in or fencing out. And here there was a path put in as well, although that was all moved in order to help improve the situation. So compaction, of course, reduces the air spaces, leading to anaerobic conditions. Erosion and displacement of the soil is a physical damage very often, which is the same, I guess, as in soil levels. Changes in soil levels can alter the anaerobic or the aerobic conditions and may also result in direct damage. Changes in hydrology and the water table also has the same impact. Ploughing may cause direct damage. Chemical damage such as salt or herbicides or fungicides may also have an impact. And reducing that damage is avoiding anything that disrupts the normal functioning of the soil and including the natural processes. So, our job as a veteran tree manager that we want you to be able to identify in the standard is to ensure that the growing conditions are optimal for that veteran tree. So there may be various different ways in which you can do that, including, avoiding the cause of the problem. So avoiding ploughing, for example, stopping any chemical treatments on the soil, setting up and identifying root protection areas, and using the standard practice for that process, so the 15 times the trunk diameter or 5 metres beyond the drip line, and looking at ways in which we can improve the kind of natural functioning of the soil. So that's what we've talked about here, nutrient deficiency or excess, which is related back to what we've just talked about, and the physical soil damage as well as the erosion. So here is an example of some work that's been done about mulching a tree, and there's all sorts of different techniques out there. We have a fact sheet about mulching, but of course clearly it's about removing whatever is causing the problem. So if that's the animals that are all congregating under the tree, or if it's cars parking under the tree, whatever it might be, remove the problem, prevent further damage, and see what possible options there are for remediation. Organic matter, such as mulch, other things are compost tea, use good practice. There's a whole kind of, someone once said to me that there's a whole sorcerer's mix of potions that are potentially available for working with tree roots, but use those that are well established and have got some good research background. That's what we're trying to, for the vet specialist to be able to propose and have knowledge in, are those techniques that there may be sorcerer's apprentice mix of different techniques, but which ones are most appropriate for managing veteran trees. As I said, there is a nice fact sheet there. And we would expect you to be talking about how slowly this might be done, if it's required over the whole root system, parts of the root system, how it might be monitored, and what it is that you would be looking for when you're monitoring the consequences of that kind of remediation. And that we'd be looking to hear that, veteran trees don't cope well with large and fast changes, and that it's much better to do things on a staged by stage basis. And the final element of the root unit is about identifying where roots and mycorrhizal fungi grow. Now, that's perhaps easier said than done because we can't see them. And so this is divided up into, again, a few subsections. And so we'd be expecting you to understand what's the common root architecture patterns, how root development is influenced by the rooting environment. So, anchorage and feeding is, of course, the standard elements of what roots are doing, but that their depth and how far from the tree they go, that this is a dynamic process and that roots change and develop and move and grow and die and reiterate in much the same way that a crown may do, but over a very different kind of area. And that, the idea is that these are not the reflection, the roots are not a reflection of the crown. They're much more like the base of a wine glass, and they're much wider than the crown, and that change with age as well. The tap roots disappeared. We may get more lateral spread. They're influenced by pH, by water, oxygen availability, physical barriers within the soil. And the issue here with relation to veteran trees is that the process of reiteration and retrenchment will have been going on for a much, much longer period of time. The roots will have been impacted over a much longer period of time by the surrounding environment and the historic environment. And that this should be clear to the vet specialist that this can be a dynamic process. And here's just an example of a photograph that was taken to highlight how far from the trees the roots can be. And that's up to you as a vet cert specialist to be able to fight, if you like, for the rooting area, the underground hidden part of the tree, which is very often overlooked. We want you to be able to explain the relationship between roots and shoots and the fact that these are directly linked, which seems very straightforward, but it's an important element. Now, also, there's often a time delay, of course. If a tree is pollarded, the roots will presumably have a much, much bigger biomass than the crown will at that pollarding instance. But the roots and the shoots will refine some kind of balance. You will expect there to be some root dieback as a consequence of pruning, for example. And there generally appears to be some kind of balance between the root and the shoot area. And that's up to us as vet cert specialists to be able to think about that, to be able to convey that message, and that the fact that signals and signs and symptoms that we might see in the crown may be related to what's going on in the roots, either poor water nutrient uptake or even damage to the roots. And here's an example that this tree is being ploughed. I mean, it has an area there which has not been ploughed, but we don't know how long that's been for. We can see damage at the base, but the dieback in the crown probably is not related to natural retrenchment, that it may well be related to direct damage. We've also got thinning crown all over the crown. So it's that kind of relationship that we would be expecting the vet cert specialist to be able to see, spot, explain and describe. Then the other element of this point 4 here in roots is describe the types of symbiotic relationships between tree roots and other organisms and explain their benefits. And of course, mycorrhiza and bacteria are the two main parts of this, and that they are symbiotic organisms. They're a relationship between two or more organisms and both benefit from this relationship. Mycorrhizae and tree roots, the fungus gives the tree the hard to reach nutrients, in particular phosphorus, and the tree gives the mycorrhizal fungi carbohydrates. And that there are different species that are non-species specific, and there's some that are very specific to an individual tree species. There's much that we still don't understand about this close relationship, but what we do often see is that the mycorrhizal fruiting bodies are often a long way away from the tree, which give an indication of how far the fine roots in particular extend. They can be a good indication of the root extent, and that's also something that we would expect a vet cert specialist to be able to pick up on. Then bacteria, of course, have also an important role to play. They can be involved in the nitrogen fixing process and again make difficult to reach nutrients more easily available for trees. We would also expect that the difference between the endomycorrhizae and the ectomycorrhizae, so that you've got the specialist fungus species with a one-on-one relationship with a tree and those that are more generalist. There's also a really good video. We've got several videos available on the Vet Cert website about fungi and trees, and there's one particular on mycorrhizae and on managing mycorrhizae. I would really recommend that you spend the time watching those. They're with Lynn Boddy, Professor Lynn Boddy. So the final two elements of this unit is about show an awareness. We would expect you to be able to show an awareness of the problems associated with identifying actual root location. Well, it's stating the bleeding obvious when we say that they're hidden by the soil, but that they are also opportunistic and that barriers will influence how they grow. So, for example, if you have a rock face that the tree is growing up against, it's more likely that the roots will be in the direction away from that physical barrier. And its influence, that root growth, we would expect you to be able to be aware of what root growth is influenced by. So oxygen, water, nutrient availability, soil, bacteria, mycorrhizae, and that you need to dig to see them. And even if there are other techniques available, which leads me into the final element on this unit, is that there are lots of different methods out there to identify where roots are and how far they extend and how large they are, if they're functioning or not, and that we would expect the vet cert specialist to be aware of those different methods and also to be able to evaluate them. Now I'm using that word again. If you remember in the beginning, we talked about the word evaluate, where we would expect the vet cert specialist to be able to understand the pros and cons with those different methods. Things like, what is it that's good about them? So digging with a spade is cheap, but it potentially damages roots, and also you can only see the roots where you dig. Things like ground penetrating radar is a great technique, but it's expensive and it only gives you roots up to kind of the size of your thumb. Sometimes there's challenges with identifying which tree the roots are associated with. Root tomography is another method, and each of them has their advantages and disadvantages, including cost, time, accuracy, and so on. So this is very important for the vet cert specialist to be able to at least have a working knowledge of those different techniques and their pros and cons in relation to identifying roots with regards to veteran trees. And here's an example of the root radar. This is a picture from the ARB show where the root radar was demonstrated. And here's another example, digging holes. It's always a winner, it's cheap, got a spade in the back of the car. But again, what are the pros and cons with digging small pits to find the roots? So finally on this session, it's just the identification of the resources that are available to you. Again, I recommend David Lonsdale's book, Chapter 3. There's a section on the sites and surroundings. And in Helen Reid's book from 2000, there's Chapter 5. It focuses on the management of the land around the trees. Those two resources are available at the Ancient Tree Forum website. There's also a mulching fact sheet, which is on the VetCert website. And this is just an overview of the pros and cons and the different mechanisms and methods that are available. And then there are, of course, a number of videos. There's some vet tree videos. One of them, The Importance of the Land Around a Veteran Tree, which is a more general management focused video about different pros and cons and ways of managing the land around a veteran tree. And then there are some vet cert videos, as I said, with Lynn Body, which are focusing specifically on fungi, and there's one on managing mycorrhizae. And there's a couple of articles that I'd like to draw your attention to. Root Protection Areas for Veteran Trees, Part 1 and 2, which were in the ARB Association's ARB mag, and again, those are available on the Ancient Tree Forum website. So that's it for Unit 3. And again, there's plenty of resources for you to read more if you would like to. There has been a free course available called Soils Introducing the World Beneath Our Feet, which was from Lancaster University. I'm not sure if that's still available, but that may be worth looking at. And the next session will be focusing on veteran trees as ecosystems. So thank you and see you again soon.